Although value-added tax schemes have gained widespread use around the world, people in the United States have historically been extremely reluctant to even consider the idea of a value-added tax. However, the exploding federal budget deficit has prompted leaders like House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to say that the idea of a value-added tax is now on the table to try to bridge the gap between government expenditures and tax revenues. I'm surprised that either party would consider implementing a value-added tax at this particular time. First of all, the Democratic Party has typically been opposed to regressive taxes, and it can be argued that value-added taxes are inherently regressive because they place a higher tax burden on lower-income individuals. Essentially, a regressive tax forces people with lower incomes to spend a higher proportion of their income on a tax than higher-income individuals. An example of a progressive tax is the income tax, where higher incomes pay higher tax rates, lower incomes pay lower. But with a value-added tax, lower-income consumers would pay a larger proportion of their income toward essential goods and services than would higher-income individuals. Now, governments often try to solve this problem by exempting certain products from value-added taxes, or shifting the responsibility of value-added taxes from one set of products like food staples to another like consumer electronics. And the theory is that by shifting value-added taxes, you remove some of this inherently regressive nature of the VAT. What this causes, though, is for revenues from the VAT tax to be lower than expected. And when you take away the value-added tax from one set of products like food, you have to increase the tax rate on another set to make up that lost revenue. This creates more bureaucracy and more chances for politicians to manipulate the system to benefit one state or one group of people or one industry, and it brings in a whole host of protectionist issues into the tax. So regardless of your feelings on progressive and regressive taxes, you can argue that the implementation of a value-added tax, because of its perception as being regressive, would cause substantial bureaucracy to try to find workarounds to benefit lower-income consumers and to maintain the levels of revenue that the value-added tax is purported to be able to generate. Now, besides Democrats, Republicans are obviously opposed to a value-added tax because it violates their specific no new taxes promise and in general increases the size of the government at a time when the Republican Party, as sort of an overall strategy, believes that reducing the size of government and reducing tax burdens are an important part of its message for midterm elections and beyond. Beyond the obvious political implications of a value-added tax are some inherent problems with the tax itself. I've already alluded to some of these. It's unlikely that a value-added tax, even if it were implemented and calibrated correctly, would generate the revenue that the government expects, because anytime you implement a new tax, it will change people's consumption patterns. So some goods will become less attractive, others more attractive, and predicting the actual revenues is extremely difficult. And second, it's highly unlikely that the federal government would accompany a value-added tax with any kind of balanced budget provision that would ensure that the revenues from a value-added tax would actually go toward paying down debt or reducing deficit expenditures. The size of the gap between government expenditures and tax revenues is also a critical problem. As I just said, without balanced budget provisions alongside any new taxes, the spending record of both parties, frankly, indicates that any new tax revenues will simply be taken in and spent on still more government programs. And if the value-added tax is implemented with the idea of balancing the budget, ultimately, without these types of restrictive provisions, the tax will become just another source of revenue for the typical social welfare, defense spending, any number of government programs that utilize large amounts of tax revenues. Another problem with implementing a value-added tax is people in the United States have a historical aversion to any kind of tax on consumption, and this is especially important during a time of economic recovery. Commentator John Walker made an interesting analogy when he stressed that the federal tax on gasoline has remained unchanged for several years. The tax is not scaled to inflation, and so the 15% per gallon surcharge on each gallon of gasoline has been where it's been for decades now, and it's become a dwindling source of revenues proportional to other taxes. The reason the gasoline tax has never changed is that consumers absolutely hate the idea of paying more for gasoline. Various environmental groups and government officials looking to increase revenues have occasionally talked about raising the tax on gasoline to increase revenues, but the idea has never gotten traction because the vehement outrage from the electorate means it's just completely politically non-viable. So what we see with something like a value-added tax is another tax on consumption, and the American public absolutely hates taxes on consumption. I don't want to debate whether or not this is a good attitude or a bad attitude, but it's a political reality. Any party that tries to implement a value-added tax will have to face the inevitable questions of whether or not the tax is decreasing consumption, and with the decrease in consumption, is the value-added tax harming economic recovery? These are difficult questions to answer, but the majority of people believe that consumption taxes will decrease the rate at which the economy recovers from the recession. The value-added tax would almost certainly increase pressures on consumers who are already facing a slew of different cost increases for commodities, shrinking wages, and employment issues. Ultimately, value-added taxes directly increase the cost of goods for consumers. Value-added taxes are difficult to implement, require increases in an already bureaucratic tax system, and are extremely politically unpopular. I'm very surprised that the idea of a value-added tax is being considered seriously in Washington, D.C. It's my opinion that a value-added tax would not do long-term good. I don't think it would actually solve deficit spending. I believe that the collection of the tax would increase costs. I believe the tax revenues themselves would not be as large as people might estimate. And most importantly, I believe that the current status quo in Washington, D.C. would simply take any new additional revenues from a tax like this and spend it on any number of government programs or agencies. Ultimately, without balanced budget provisions, any new taxes will fall into this trap, and that's why I essentially don't trust Washington, D.C. to be good stewards of tax revenues in any kind of new scheme. So ultimately, I think the value-added tax is a terrible idea. I think it's political suicide for anyone who actually tries to implement it, and I do think it would hurt the economy and our recovery from recession. So I hope you've enjoyed this entry with my look at value-added taxes and why I think they're a bad idea, and I hope you'll check out my website at www.econoutlook.com for more information, and I will see you next week with a new entry. Thanks as always.